All right. Well, thank you so much for the invitation to present today. So don't worry, I do know that this is a surface dynamics conference. So I'm actually not going to be spending a whole lot of time talking about the mechanical aspects of hydrologic modeling. In fact, oops, how do I? Oh. Instead, my goals today are really to share mistakes that I've made with Indigenous communities with the hope that this can help all of us recognize and stop harms that our science inflicts. I'll then share how I have been collaborating now with Indigenous partners to show how this can help make our science more just and intellectually better. Okay, so just to be clear, I'm not Indigenous. I am a second-generation Chinese American. Here's actually a pretty goofy photo with my family here. And even though I've really identified my whole life as coming from an immigrant family, I have come to realize that I am a settler here because my family came to this place to benefit from it without compensating or acknowledging the Indigenous peoples here. And I have to say that those benefits have brought me all kinds of advantages professionally. That's why I get to do what I do today. I get to play around with integrated hydrological models. And I have to say that I got to this place through really conventional academic training through which I learned that expertise is gained within academic walls like these. And my process of learning to work with communities outside of academia was honestly a pretty bumpy one at first, and I'll actually explain that. You see, moving to Minnesota 12 years ago now, wild rice was really just a specialty food to me. But I began to understand that it actually grows naturally in shallow lakes and streams around the upper Great Lakes region. And furthermore, it holds profound importance culturally for Indigenous peoples here. And even though legally it is supposed to be protected by treaties signed between sovereign tribal nations and the federal US government, wild rice has been in severe decline across the region due to impairments from Euro-American settlement and colonization. Now, what piqued my interest, though, as a hydrologist, is that Minnesota has a really unique water quality standard that is set to protect wild rice from sulfate pollution, which has been shown to harm its growth. The issue, though, is that industries have been really pushing back on this standard. They've been trying to, say that there's maybe still some uncertainties in, what exactly happens to sulfate once it gets into the environment. Well, I started realizing that nobody was really thinking about what role groundwater can play. And so I dove in and I started, looking at this with my groundwater and reactive transport models. And I have to say, it actually got really interesting when I started pairing up with a geomicrobiologist. We were coming up with all these new conceptual models of how groundwater and surface water exchange or hyporheic exchange actually controls coupled iron sulfur carbon cycling in wetland systems. But you know what? Something started to bother me here. As we were getting caught up with all that quote unquote real science and, publications and all that, I realized that even though the original motivation for our work was to help tribal nations protect a sacred plant from industrial pollutants, honestly, wild rice, people, they hardly entered my research picture at all. So that's when I first tried setting things right. I started collaborating with social scientists. I ventured way out of my comfort zone. I reached out to a number of their tribal contacts, and we put together a new interdisciplinary proposal that we were really fortunate to get funded. When I went to share the news of the award with the tribal contacts, I was actually really caught off guard because they actually expressed a lot of disappointment in me. They pointed out that actually, after they sent me their letter of support, they never heard back from me. Thinking back, I'm not even sure that I ever even sent them the final draft of the proposal. So when I finally took the time to listen to them, I realized that other University of Minnesota researchers were conducting genetics and cultivation research on wild rice, despite tribes' objections to it as a desecration of something that is spiritually important to them. I found out that researchers commonly trespass on reservation lands for their fieldwork, and I learned that tribal members even get written into proposals sometimes without even being asked because, that's a whole bunch of broader impact points right there. Well, what I realized is that I was starting down that same exact path of harm when I failed to fully engage Indigenous peoples in my work. So at that point, my co-PIs and I decided to do something that honestly we knew was risky for a career. At that point, we were all pre-tenure, but it was really what we had to do if we were going to be able to sleep at night. We actually spent most of the entire first year in our grant not working on any of the original research plan, for which, yeah, we sought some tribal input, but definitely nowhere near enough. Instead, we simply traveled around to different tribal spaces and we listened. And as a result of that, I can now say that I understand why I need to acknowledge the 7 Ojibwe nations and the 4 Dakota nations that share geography with Minnesota, where I live and work. It is telling me to sign into iMessage. I'm going to say cancel. Okay. Yeah, I now understand why that's so important. And furthermore, I also know that the Indigenous lands that were used to establish my institution, University of Minnesota, where we're all sitting today, extends far beyond just the physical footprint of this campus. And that's because in blue there, those are all parcels of land that the US government violently appropriated from mostly the Dakota, also the Ojibwe, and granted to University of Minnesota as investment lands for its establishment through the Morrill Act of 1863. And anyone in this room that has any connection with the land-grant university, I ask that you also think about the history of your institution, which you all benefit from. So now, understanding that whole fraught history, we have been forming, over the last 8 years, a more just collaborative. Our team formally includes tribal natural resource managers and harvesters from 7 Ojibwe nations and 2 Ojibwe intertribal organizations, as well as Native and non-Native researchers and students from University of Minnesota. We now jointly come up with our research plans that we work together on. Our project was given this Ojibwe title, Kawegadan Nanagarawindam Minomen, which I'm told means first we must consider wild rice, which the Ojibwe call Minomen and the Dakota call Psing. This title reminds us all that we are working to protect a sacred plant relative for tribal nations. And as our tribal contacts became tribal partners, they began sharing the many different environmental and human connections that they know to influence wild rice. My former PhD student, Maddie Nyblade, actually started to map it all out, and you can see that it got pretty complex, right? Furthermore, tribal partners pointed out that my initial focus on sulfate hydrobiogeochemistry, even though I thought it was so interdisciplinary, it was really just a small and incomplete sliver of the broader picture. And indeed, conventional academic science is usually considered discipline-based and separated from human values, whereas Indigenous scholars have described Indigenous knowledge as holistic, integrative, and relational. In our project, we hope that if we can build enough trust and ensure that Indigenous knowledge is not appropriated or exploited, then hopefully our tribal partners can help us identify what slices are useful for us as conventional scientists to work on, and hopefully they can then guide us in figuring out how to add the slices back in so we can widen our understanding of the fuller picture. And so this is where Indigenous community engagement can make our science intellectually better. Okay, so I know that community engagement can feel a whole lot more obvious in field science because after all, that's when you can get in a canoe together, right? But integrated modeling has so much to benefit from Indigenous knowledge. We have been trying to couple more and more domains together, right? Because we know that's what we need to do with our models in order to solve those really wicked, complex global change problems. Now, we're definitely making advances, many by folks in this room, right? But we're still stymied by challenges such as determining which processes and scales actually matter for a certain problem. And we have to deal with ever more intensive data needs for our model inputs, calibration, and validation. Well, I've begun to see Indigenous knowledge, which is fundamentally holistic and can provide generations of local observations, as a really powerful way to addressing these challenges. But that also has led me to ask, how in the world do we actually put these two together? Well, I realized that actually human dimensions are already being added to Earth systems models that I'm using. But this picture still doesn't include people. It just includes new parameterizations for heat and water fluxes for urban and agricultural systems. So I started reading about something called agent-based models, and these do explicitly represent people's behavior. But you know what? This still didn't feel right to me. My Lac de Flambeau tribal partner, Joe Gravine, has been teaching us how to carve traditional rice halving sticks, and he's been urging us to put the spirit back into science by building relationships together. Reducing him into a cartoon, into a number, into a model would be the antithesis of that. So that's when I realized it's not about incorporating indigenous community members and indigenous knowledge as model subjects and variables. Instead, it's about engaging with them as partners and guides. So I'd now like to share an example of how my group has been learning to carry out modeling with indigenous partners. So as we were trying to think more holistically about wild rice, Shannon Kesner, one of our tribal partners from the Fond du Lac Band, pushed us to consider what happens if the forest around a wild rice lake or stream changes, like what can maybe happen with climate change. Well, our partners from Lac de Flambeau had a similar interest, so my postdoc Xiaoqing Liu set up an integrated hydrologic model, CLM, to look at runoff to one of their wild rice rivers. He set up 3 different scenarios, one with current conditions, another with only future climate change, and another with an additional shift from conifer to deciduous forest, because that's actually what's anticipated to happen under warmer temperatures here. So we're ready to go, but actually we quickly realized that there were some tensions we had to reconcile. Computational models are quantitative. They're necessarily reductionist and technical based, whereas indigenous knowledge tends to be phenomenological, and as I already explained, holistic and relational based. Well, we found that the answer to bridging these was putting that spirit back into science by sharing meals and observations. And I've got to say, having a lot of Zoom meetings to think through processes together. Okay, I do have to acknowledge that this method definitely takes a lot of time and energy. We started this all 8 years ago, and we only just submitted our paper a couple weeks ago. But I can guarantee you that it was absolutely worth it. Here's what it allowed us to find. So actually at first, our model results seemed pretty underwhelming. They suggested that additional forest type change wouldn't actually have any appreciable impact on annual total runoff in the future. But fortunately, we had indigenous knowledge filling the gaps on what to look at with the model. Specifically, tribal co-authors Eric Chapman and Joe Gravine from Lac de Flambeau encouraged us to look more closely at the springtime, because that's when they told us wild rice seedlings are the most vulnerable to fast flows. And when we did look at that, we realized that simulations showed that in the springtime, that additional forest type change would actually trigger notably greater extreme runoff compared to both the present day and the climate change only scenarios. The model further showed that the difference in extreme runoff between the forest types was due to differences in snowmelt, because open deciduous forest canopies allow in a lot more radiation to penetrate to the ground. Honestly, I have to admit, this surprised me, because in the ecohydrology literature, there's so much focus on differences in transpiration between the forest types. But interestingly, our tribal partners said that this model actually made a whole lot of sense to them, because their elders talk about old growth conifers generating dark places that are essential for their medicinal plants to grow. So here we had indigenous knowledge helping to calibrate and validate a computer model that was helping us uncover new insights about compounded climate and forest change effects on snow hydrology, which I'll point out is a topic that is severely understudied outside of mountainous regions. And this, in turn, is allowing tribal nations to predict and help prepare for future threats to their wild rice. Now, working with indigenous partners is leading to many exciting research findings, I can tell you that. But what I really want to emphasize is that none of that would have been possible without the first critical lesson we learned with and from tribal nations. And that is the importance of first building a trusting partnership, which is why our collaborative's very first publication, led by my postdoc Laura Madsen, and had 38 tribal and University of Minnesota co-authors, shares the 10 tenets that we found for doing this. And hoping that it can be helpful for others, we've included in the appendix a copy of our co-developed protocol for responsible research with tribal nations, which importantly honors tribal data sovereignty. Okay, my last couple of slides here, I want to acknowledge I'm definitely still figuring out how to work in a good way with Indigenous partners. And I say this to invite all of you in the entire modeling community to work together with me on this. As I started collaborating with tribal nations around the Great Lakes, I realized I was actually still doing colonial helicopter science in another project in which I was investigating the impacts of tropical glacier retreat in the Ecuadorian Andes. Here I was touting the new integrated models that we were developing for dealing with remote and data-sparse sites, because somehow doing that felt like a more clever solution than actually working with local Indigenous Quechua communities, who certainly know plenty about their mountains. Plus, not only did we fail to engage with Quechua communities in research, but despite their signage, we didn't even get their permission about accessing their lands. We thought we were covered by the state permits we obtained, even though those were coming from the settler colonial system. But now we have apologized, and we are only continuing our work there with the right permissions that we've now gained from 6 of the Quechua communities living near our field site. And we have been co-developing protocols for responsible research that resonate culturally in the Andes. Meanwhile, we're also sharing food and music together. There are definitely a lot of awkward moments of scientists trying to dance there. But this is all allowing us to work together, not only in the field, but yes, with modeling. There's a photo there of my PhD student, Ali Jacoby. She is explaining to community members how her integrated watershed model works, and she's getting direction now on what hypotheses to test with the model, having to do with interactions of glaciers and ecohydrology, and she's getting guidance from them on as to whether or not her preliminary simulations of discharge actually make any sense. Now, the collaboration stories for both my wild rice and Ecuador projects are still very much to be continued. But here are just some takeaways that I so far see about conducting integrated modeling with Indigenous community partners. Not only can it help us stop and avoid the harms inflicted by mainstream science, but collaborations that simultaneously advance science impacts alongside basic research are more necessary than ever, given our current political constraints today on community-oriented work. And I'll say that as AI takes over our coding jobs, maybe now we should focus on building human relationships and holding ourselves accountable to protocols that ensure tribal sovereignty. And all this can allow us to integrate knowledges, which should be led by Indigenous partners, not research subjects. And when we do work with Indigenous partners, we can be sure that we are actually addressing questions that are important for communities, something that I'm sure is important to all of you. And in turn, we will find that Indigenous worldviews can guide, complement, and expand conventional scientific models and understanding. In other words, collaboration with Indigenous partners and inclusion of Indigenous knowledge, I hope you can now see, can make our science more just and intellectually better. And finally, I'll add, it can make our work more human and fun too. So thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Chris. We have time for a question. I see 2 questions. We're going to do 2 questions. Rick, so you can start off.
Thanks for a lovely talk. I'm curious whether you've had any experiences where the folks that you've worked with, any of them have gotten more interested in science as a result of your engagement.
Oh, the question is whether or not folks have gotten more interested in science as a result of our engagement. So definitely there's so much I could talk about in this work just as to how much it's taught me. And one thing I probably did not get a chance to emphasize more is just the role of students and, you know, students from all kinds of backgrounds, but we have had the honor and the pleasure of having a lot of Indigenous students on our project as well. And I think that one thing I have heard from them is how much they appreciate when they can see the values and the experiences they bring in personally, when that can align with science and not be butting heads with it, then you know, I think this inspires them and motivates them in certain ways. I mean, we've had students who, you know, summer interns, REU programs where, you know, usually you might look over certain transcripts and be like, oh, I don't know, would that be the most appropriate intern to accept? But you just see, I have seen just how excited and how inspired students become when the research matters to them and it just engages, you know, yes, the math, yes, the science, but also other meaning. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. That was really, really inspiring. One dimension of the kind of respect and partnership, I'd be interested in how it worked out with your projects, is just how you work your budgets with the compensation for the labor that the Indigenous partners are contributing to the projects.
Yeah, thanks for that question. So just thinking about the respect that's owed in these types of relationships, the question was about budget and how we can be, I think, appropriately compensating Indigenous communities. I think this is this is a really, really important question. And one thing we've really worked to do is in our grants to have dedicated budget lines and sub-awards for tribal partners who work with us. So that is definitely important, but I can also say that it's been challenging because it turns out all the administrative hoops that have to be jumped through to get a budget are not trivial. That's why we have SPA. That's why we have our sponsored projects office. And that's why, I mean, that's where some of our like huge overheads go to. And honestly, I mean, it's a gatekeeper, honestly. It's been pretty depressing for me to share that we have obtained and made sure we carved out sub-awards for some of our tribal partners. And in the end, they actually ended up not taking it because they said it was so much trouble and it was so difficult for their, for their admin to take it. And so we've had to find different ways. So oftentimes this is not ideal for me. This is not how I want to be doing it, but often we're still taking the funds through University of Minnesota, but then paying it back out as consultant fees. If we try as much as we can, I try to stuff as much as I can under the participant costs so that University of Minnesota isn't taking their 54% before it gets sent back out. But I think it's still not ideal because it still means I'm the one who's signing off on it where I shouldn't be.